Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into when sex becomes a chore. So this episode comes from one of my favorite people to, generate podcast content from, and that is Jimmy on relationships. So
Can you tell me a little bit about him? Maybe our listeners don't know either. Is he a therapist or is he just a guy who's interested in
I think he's just a guy who's interested. Maybe he's a therapist. I don't know. I haven't been able to find out. I haven't looked too much into it. I just know he posts a lot of videos on relationships.
I like his presence. I mean,
yes.
I think he does a great job with the content and recording. I disagree with some of the stuff. We'll talk about it today, but
okay.
I think he's certainly a good listen. I enjoy watching him.
I know, and a lot of his stuff is funny too. Like he posts and it's entertaining. And anyways, and so this episode, it's called "Taking a Break from the Bedroom," is what the title is called. Now he avoids using the term sex, probably because it's on YouTube, and when you say things like sex, then it gets explicit, and then it's harder for people to see it when you talk about sex, which I understand because
I didn't know that.
But when we discuss this episode, we will talk about sex, and as always, we are professional. We use clinical terms.
Right. I mean, when I think about what we're going to talk about, I think that's probably the only term we're going to use. Is sex. I don't know that it has to be any more detailed than that.
It's yeah.
I mean, for today.
Well, I mean, talking about orgasm, but I mean,
yeah,
because we'll get into that too. But yeah, but anyways, the point is like we're professional as always when we talk about sexuality. So this episode, and it starts off with this guy saying, "My wife said that the bedroom is starting to become like a chore." And this other guy goes, he's like, "Ooh, yeah, I've been there." And he's like, "Well, what did you do about it?" And this guy says, "Well, I took it off the table." And he's like, "What do you mean take it off? How do you take that off the table?" Right? Like this one guy, he seemed shocked the idea that you would just not have sex for a couple of weeks. Like this seemed to genuinely shock him. And so the idea around it is that they would build the tank in other ways, right? He said something that I think is really critical here is she's not as affectionate as she used to be. And the reason being is because she's feeling a lot of pressure, because she feels like if she gives you a hug or a kiss or any sort of affection, you're going to want more and she's going to have to turn you down. And pressure kills her desire for you. And so what she's really looking for is emotional connection, right?
So I see this, I was going to guess, 3/4 of the couples that I see, probably. Very, very common.
Yeah.
And I would guess he's probably not a therapist and he does not see a lot of couples. He might be dealing with his particular situation. Right. So the things I'm going to talk about really are based on, I think, what works with couples, what's going on. So just some, I don't know if we call it background or some basic information. I think that, as we've talked about before, when you're in a brand new relationship, I've always thought it's pretty cool. What nature does is it really amps up those hormones so that both parties are wanting to be sexual much more often. And the thinking is that what's happening is we are the result of our evolution, and nature is getting us to procreate, which is kind of a fundamental goal. And so for both parties, so the women as well. So we're talking about a heterosexual relationship, of course. Right now, both parties are wanting more sex. Although this happens in gay relationships too. I mean, it's not different, but as far as that goal of procreation. So intense sexuality, intense desire at the start, and then that changes. And we've talked about that it lasts anywhere from that intense feeling lasts anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. And then typically what happens is the desire of the female goes down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it drops, and most people think that that is a result of the hormone changes that will naturally occur. So what happens is then I think men and women, a lot of men and women have this different idea about sexuality. Like the way I feel about it is the way the other person feels about it. So from a
Yeah.
male's perspective, the man typically, again, we're making generalizations, but typically the male is going to have a higher desire throughout the lifespan of the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not going to be true for female typically. And
Yeah.
so the male then makes this okay, but my partner, my wife does not want to have sex with me. She's lost interest. She doesn't find me attractive. They tend to personalize it. And then for the women, what they do is they have that loss of desire and they then tend to talk about it or think about it negatively about their male partner. Oh, all he does is think about sex. All he wants is sex. And so because that changes and couples don't talk about it. See,
Mm-hmm.
they don't talk about it until they come in for help or I mean it's a common problem, but people don't think about it or talk about it. Like how are we going to
Yeah.
manage this transition when it happens? It is inevitable
Yeah.
that in any relationship, any long-term relationship, this is going to happen. It's rare that it doesn't.
Right. I think that you said there's like a 10% chance of
Yeah,
meeting somebody or, pairing up with somebody who has the exact same
yeah,
sexual desire as you. It's
yeah.
very, very uncommon. And, I find it interesting, this idea of sex seeming like a chore. And this seems to be a lot more common for women than men. Again, a
Right,
generalization. The opposite can be true.
right.
So, from my perspective, there are two major components why this happens. One, orgasm is way easier for men than it is for women, just due to physiology. Typically, that's typically the case, right?
No,
And then,
no, I think you're right. I think I'm that's true. What you just said is true.
well, I think there's another component too. I think it's because men and women, they differ in their sexuality, and sex means different things to men than it does to women, right? So women,
Yes.
or at least in terms of how arousal starts. So arousal starting for men is typically much different than the way it starts for women. Women typically need more. They need emotion, they need feeling, they need more to just be aroused. Whereas a man, you just start talking about sex, bam, they're good to go. They're turned on,
Right.
they're aroused, and they're ready to go.
So all of that is true. I think that the other component though is just the context of life because
Yeah.
typically what happens, you hook up, you're really focused, you have that high energy, that high passion. And
Mhm.
then as that starts to dip, what happens? You get involved in your careers, you might have kids. I mean,
Yep.
so there's this whole thing that changes where typically what happens, I think, again, maybe our disclaimer at the start should be we're going to make a lot of generalizations, but
Yep.
I I think that generally they're true.
Yeah.
So what happens is I think often the male stops paying as close of emotional attention
Hmm.
as he used to. And so what happens, you get involved in work with the kids, you're tired, you're both tired.
Yep.
And so focusing on that emotional connection is gets lost somewhere in the relationship. And so as you just said, I think that in long-term relationships, typically women want to have that they want to feel emotionally close
Hmm.
to their partners before they engage in sexuality. And for men, as I've talked to a lot of men about this, they want to feel emotionally close as well, but the way they do it is through sex. I try and help women understand that their partners really want that emotional closeness as well. They're just going about it in a different way. So I think that's kind of the major thing is in long-term relationships, we want that emotional closeness. We're just trying to get it
Hmm.
in different ways. And
Right.
so with a couple, I think it's important to realize that sometimes you cross over into the other partner's realm, both of you. That's
Yes.
really important.
Yeah.
Now, and so I think what happens is often the women then are crossing over into the man's realm, meaning, okay, I'm just going to have sex. I'm not, I'm not that emotionally connected. I think that's when it becomes a chore. I think that's
Mm.
it
Yeah.
right there. And whereas for the majority of couples that I see that I'm helping with this, it's really about getting the male to focus more on the emotional connection. And I try and get them to separate the non-sexual touch from the sexual touch. I think that's really important because you mentioned this early on in this episode that if he comes up and touches her, like maybe, he comes home from work, wants a hug or something.
Yeah.
What happens is the interpretation often from the female is, oh no, here it goes. He's only touching me because he wants to have sex. And so then the result of that is that she starts pulling back even from the non-sexual touch.
Right.
And so they become disconnected physically. They're already likely disconnected emotionally, only because they aren't paying attention to it. And typically I find it to be the male who's not paying enough attention to being emotionally connected. So I think that's kind of the groundwork for most of this issue is high passion to start. The long-term relationship, they have kids, their jobs, they start neglecting their emotional relationship and connection because they're too busy and they're tired. I get it. I understand it. And then the wife thinks, okay, if he touches me, he's going to want sex, and I'm just not there. Because, again, you talked about men are easily aroused, women not so easily.
Yep.
And then they pull back and they don't touch. And that's then when I start to see them. We don't touch, we don't talk, we don't have sex. It's very difficult, but solvable.
Yes. And so when you start to feel that pull back, or when you start to say, or if you start, your husband comes to give you a hug and you start to feel, oh no, I do not have it in me to have sex with you today. If that's what you're thinking, that's when you have the dialogue. And that's where you start is, hey, what does it mean to you when you hug me like this? Right? Or what are you trying to say? Or where is this coming from? And ask your partner and be straightforward. Are you hugging me because you want to have sex? Because sometimes that's how it feels. And I need to understand where you're at in your emotional space with this.
So I think that's a good idea. I think that to ask about it is certainly important, but also just to be able to separate in your mind non-sexual touch from sexual touch, because I think the solution, it's multifaceted, but I think maybe the major component of the solution is that I try and help the men to really figure out how to focus on the emotional connection.
Yeah.
And it's not, in my experience, it's not that they don't want to. I think we don't teach men how to do that very well. I think they don't know what that means. A lot of them have no idea what that means when they come in. And so you just start talking about, what does it mean for your wife or your partner to be emotionally connected? No one talks about that.
And I think a lot of it is because it's individualized. It's going to feel,
well, that's right. Yes.
It's going to be different. What helps me to feel emotionally connected to Curtis, that's me as an individual.
That is absolutely right. And so that's why you need to have the conversation and realize. And so I think when he talks about taking a break, so this is one of the problems I had with it.
Okay.
So let's just talk a little diversion, that taking a break from sex in the bedroom is a technique we use, but typically only in the case of sexual trauma.
Oh, okay.
On the part of statistically, it's going to be the female who's going to have the sexual trauma.
Right.
And the thinking is, and the way it works, is that in any type of sexual trauma, the female has their power taken away.
Right.
And so power and control. And so inadvertently, and this typically is never a conscious thing by the male, but it feels like sometimes that the male's taking the power and control away.
Yeah.
Because typically the trauma would have been, with another male who took that power and control away. And so what you want to do is slow it down and give the power and control back to the female, not on a permanent basis, but temporarily. When we talk temporarily, we're probably talking several months.
Yeah. Well,
we're talking several months for it to readjust.
Right. And that really stands just from triggers. So because anytime any sort of sexual encounter, or there's a
Right.
component in the brain that's going to be activated and she's going to feel triggered. And as we've
Right.
mentioned before, the brain has no temporal component, so she's automatically going to be back in that situation of sexual trauma,
That's
which is
it.
yeah,
Exactly.
which is a complete aside. You know,
Well, I just wanted to explain that I think
yeah,
we do use that break in the bedroom. I never use it in this case, though.
okay.
And so if we go back to what we're talking about, as far as the emotional disconnection,
Mm-hmm.
I never suggest it in that case because I don't think that's the solution.
Okay.
So I watched this episode from Jimmy on relationships, several, when you sent it to me, which was a
Mm-hmm.
couple of weeks ago. So I can't remember how much he talks about really working on the emotional connection, and that I don't know if he even talks about it in terms of that. The way I think about it, it's more the male's obligation or process to focus on that connection.
Yeah, he took it off the table. So he said I took it off the table for several weeks and worked on filling our tank in other ways, right? Filling the
So
emotional.
that's how he's talking about it right there.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And
See,
I and I think you can do both, right? Like I think that you can have the dialogue.
but again, so from my experience with couples,
Hmm.
it typically doesn't take that long, a couple weeks, because
Yeah.
if the male can really focus on, well, he calls it filling their tanks, which
Yeah.
is a fine term. That
Yeah.
I mean, I
Hmm.
agree with that. Gottman would call it the marital bank account, the term he would use,
Yeah.
and I use that term often. So, and I mean, the point is really good because if your marital bank account is empty or in overdraft situation, your wife isn't going to want to. I mean, typically the female isn't going to want to be sexual, and so the goal of filling that up, typically, again from my experience, doesn't take that long, and often it's just okay. Now my husband gets it, and he's starting to focus more. Often it's just that, but
Right.
what you really want to work on is how can you be consistent. See,
Hmm.
so I guess one of my troubles with this particular episode, Jimmy, is it's not a 2-week process.
Yeah.
It is this is a lifelong process
Hmm.
that you should be focusing on filling that marital bank account every single day. That
Yep.
and so that I think is the solution. I don't know that taking a break is that helpful in this case
Yeah.
because often what the wife wants is just that emotional attention or help
Hmm.
around the house. I mean, fine, it can be anything, but as you
Yeah.
said,
Yeah.
it's different, and sometimes it's just I hear many different things. Sometimes when my husband puts the kids to bed, that really is it fills her emotional because she likes to see that. It's
Hmm.
helpful. It gives her that a little rest, right? And she's better able to feel that connection. And so
Hmm.
it can be little things. I mean,
Right.
statistically, men typically do not help as much around the house or with kids. Even nowadays with younger generation, where I think men are more aware, and I think the younger generation, they are doing more than say
Yeah.
previous generations. It's still not equal. It's not.
Right.
It's not even close when
Right.
they look at it. And so, just men being more present. So that's a term I hear all the time. The wife say, "I want him to be present. I want him to notice that there are dishes in the sink. I want him to notice that the baby's diaper needs to be changed and then do it,"
Right.
as opposed to her guiding everything in the home. And what I hear often is sometimes their wives see their husbands as the extra child
Which
because I
is
have to.
not arousing.
Which is I try and say, you don't want to have sex with your kids, and so
No.
if you're
Yeah.
playing the role of the child or you're playing the role of mom to your husband, that is never going to work. And so
No.
I hope I'm not coming down too hard on men. I think that we are often unaware of what we need to do to really be involved and connected with our partners. And
Hmm.
and again, it's not our brains aren't that different. I think we want to. It's just, again, here's a generalization. Often men have been raised by by women, by mothers who took care of them too much.
Yeah.
I didn't teach them how to clean the house or how to cook a meal or how to, those things. These are kind of basic issues in a marriage that men need to step up more, I think, in a lot of ways.
And again, this isn't all men. It's not that there aren't
No,
men out
it's not
there,
all men.
right? But the majority of the couples that you see in your office as a therapist, these are the trends that you see, right? See.
So I want to acknowledge I'm seeing couples who are struggling.
Yes.
So, some of our listeners are not going to be in that category.
Right.
They're going to be couples who are not struggling. So everything I'm saying is certainly based on my experience with a certain population.
Yeah.
Where the couples are struggling. I agree with that. So the taking a break to me doesn't make a lot of sense in this particular case. I think you can do it by really focusing immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the husband sat down and said, "Okay, I get it. We're disconnected. As you said, what can I do? Have the dialogue about what has meaning to both of you, and go from there. And it doesn't need to take that long."
Right.
Yeah. And so the next thing I think we could talk about the difference in orgasms, because that is, I agree with you that is a component and so I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I mean, I deal with that as well.
Yeah.
And so I have a whole way that I deal with it.
It starts with basic biology and basic physiology, right? I mean, it starts with the basics. I mean, for men, sex is going to get them there. Just the act of penetration and thrusting. Men are going to achieve orgasm. Now, and for some women, that does work. I don't know exactly what the numbers are, but
it's over 50%, I think, of women who typically don't orgasm through intercourse. Yes. I think. It's pretty high.
That sounds right. Yeah. And so women, they need clitoral stimulation, which another thing, and we've talked about this before in the past, is that men tend to personalize that, right? They tend to take that personally.
Yes.
Absolutely wrong approach. It has absolutely nothing to do with your physiology. It has everything to do with her physiology and just the way she was made, right? The way she was born. Okay. And so it's important to address that in a relationship.
And so when I hear this in my office from the man, where they were actually just either misinformation or they don't understand the physiology, where they have linked their masculinity to their ability to give their wife an orgasm through intercourse. And I hear that all the time.
Yeah.
And I'm just blown away by that is their measure of their masculinity. And that is a hard thing for them to transition away from. Maybe it's that male culture that a lot of them are involved in. That, like you, I got married young. I mean, I've only ever been with Lindy, and so I've never been in that, I don't know the term, that locker room environment where you're talking about sex in that way, because I think a lot of it comes from that environment, where you're talking about, here's what I did over the weekend, here's what, and so you start to link your masculinity to that, and it's just not that way. So basic instruction. And again, I think I don't know why I just thought of this, that book called Come As You Are, I think is really a good book.
Yeah.
Now it's written for women. Men ought to know that. I think it's important for men to read it, personally. But I think that can be really, really helpful, because a lot of that book is based on, for women, accepting that physiology and that you're different in how you experience orgasm. And so, we've talked about this so many times, that dialogue is the most important part of a healthy relationship. You've got to talk about it. And some couples, they don't talk about it at all, at least in those terms, because, again, the male gets stuck on, well, this is the way I feel like a masculine man, and, you aren't responding. And so they then personalize it.
I don't know that I want to necessarily call that toxic masculinity. It's not as masculine as you think. It is, or at least for me, I think it is more masculine for a man to accept his partner as she is and be willing to come to her and to help her with her journey, because
That's
sex
right.
isn't
I agree.
about just
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. See, and I think toxic masculinity feels too strong to me as well, because it doesn't feel toxic. To me, it's just they're uninformed.
Yeah.
And they've equated masculinity with this thing, with this sexual act. And it's just not that way.
Here's what it is. It's self-centered. It's self-centered because it
Well,
makes
that's true. That's true.
because it's making sex all about you. It's all about, when a male says that, it's all about me. It's all about my pleasure, my desire, my abilities. Well, it's not just about you. It's about both of you. It's got to be an equal thing. And I think that's another thing that is so important for couples to talk about is, is it important for her to get there every time we have sex? Is it okay if she doesn't get there sometimes? Is it okay if you get there separately? Like, those are all discussions that you need to have, because there's no one right way to have sex. Like, there's many ways for you both to, one, feel emotionally connected and physically connected, because that orgasm is an important component. I think that's another thing that couples don't understand and talk about is when both couples achieve orgasm, there's hormones that are being released, and those hormones act as a bonding agent.
Right. And so if we go back, though, to what I talked about in the early days of a relationship, the probability that you're going to orgasm together is much higher. As you move on, it's actually pretty rare. And so if the male typically is focusing on, okay, we've got to achieve the orgasm together, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
In the vast majority of relationships, it's not going to happen together. It will happen separately. And so again, you have to start thinking about it in a different way, that having an orgasm together is not a measure of your masculinity. It's just not. And it's not a measure of the strength of the relationship at all.
Right. Yeah, because even if a woman can't orgasm, simultaneously, and it's not that it can never happen, right? It's not that it's never going to happen again. But when it's harder, it's not that he can't still be involved, right? It's not.
No, I think it's really important that he's involved.
Exactly.
Present.
Yeah.
See, and that's the education piece.
Yeah.
And so I just want to emphasize something you said a little bit earlier. I think in a lot of ways it is about being self-centered.
Yeah.
And that's why, we focus a lot on, in my office when I'm dealing with couples, we focus a lot on the male behavior and the attitude around sexuality, just how you think about it, how you think about your own masculinity, all of those things. And so often what happens is you start asking the wife, okay, how do you see when you see your husband as masculine, or, what are the things? And it's never, I'm going to say never, that's an absolute, it's never about sex.
Yeah.
It's about all the other stuff that's going on with the kids, with the housework, it's all that other stuff, how he interacts with his family. I have never heard a wife say, yeah, when my husband does this sexually, that's really nice. I've never heard that.
Yeah.
It's not part of it. And men need to figure that out, because they have attached their masculinity to this one thing.
Yeah. And I will say this, and this isn't to mitigate men's sexuality, it's not to mitigate their desires and what they find sexual. If for them, what helps them feel turned on by their wife is, like, let's say, if she's doing something, or if she initiates sex, or maybe she's wearing something that's form-fitting, or a sexy outfit. If that's arousing to him, that's not a bad thing. And we're not trying to say, oh, that's toxic masculinity.
No,
that's not at all. It's not a bad thing. And I think it's important for the wife to understand that. Like, I think it's equal, right? There's supposed to be an equal partnership, and that's kind of what we're coming to. And so I think it is just as important for a man to say, I want to know what helps you feel emotionally connected. I want to know what helps you feel sexual towards me. But this is when I feel sexual towards you. This is what turns me on. This is what is arousing.
Well, actually, there's one thing, and I think I mentioned it before, and this is pretty universal when I ask a man, I said, what turns you on the most? What do you think it is? I get one answer.
When she initiates sex.
That's it. Every time. That's all it is.
Yeah.
I mean, and we're pretty simple that way. But I think that a lot of women, it's important for them to understand that is the biggest turn on for their male partners is when they feel desired. And I get that. And again, I'm dealing with a certain population. I get that. But because I think women have this idea, oh, he's thinking about all these fantasies or something like that, which may be there. I mean, that's not a problem. But in that relationship, when she wants him, that's it.
Well, what I think it comes down to is men have this amazing ability to compartmentalize. They are so compartmentalized. And so when they're at work, they are thinking about work. When they're with their wife, they're thinking about their wife. With women, it is all connected.
But I think that's what you just said. I might disagree with. When they're with their wife, they often are not thinking about their wife.
I can see that.
I think that they need to do that more. This is the thing where I talk about being present. Now, what gets in the way, and we've talked about this again, we won't go into the phones, tablets.
Yep.
They're sitting around when they should be connecting, and one or both of them are on their phones scrolling social media. I hear it all the time. I hear it every day.
Yeah.
And so there are a lot of distractors.
Which is true. But when, and men can be distracted, but you know what?
Yeah.
Women can be just as distracted too.
Yes.
And I could,
and that's true. Yes.
And especially when it comes to sex, if they've got 5 million things on their to-do list, I tell you what, it is going to be so hard for a woman to be present and in the moment and to be ready to have sex and to actually be able to get into it because they're thinking about, the kids' homework that needs done, the dishes, the laundry. Oh, I've got to go grocery shopping.
See, that's my point, though. If the male's more present and he is involved in, if he's thinking about the kids' homework or if he's thinking about the laundry, it would leave so much stress and pressure from running a household from the wife typically that is sometimes enough.
Yeah.
Right there. And so this is a solvable problem. I mean, it's hard to change behavior, certainly. It is. It's easy to understand, I think, once you get people to start thinking about it. I think the hardest part is for men, 2 points, for men to stop being so self-centered in the relationship and getting them to think about, redefine the way they think of their masculine.
Yeah.
I think it's real important. That it goes back to what we said. You've got to have the dialogue. You've got to have the conversation about what has meaning to both of you.
Yeah.
And not just around sexuality, which is an important thought to have, but also just day-to-day living. I mean, this ties into, I think the guy who wrote The 5 Love Languages was kind of hitting on this.
Yeah.
Is that we all feel love and concern from our partner in different ways. And you've got to have the dialogue about what that is. You cannot assume that what has meaning to me has meaning to you. And that's often what happens.
Yep.
Well, I like this, so she must like this too.
Yes. You do not marry yourself.
You marry someone else. That happens in sexuality. That also happens just in day-to-day living.
Yep. Okay, takeaways.
Well, takeaway is that I think you need daily focus on the emotional connection with each other.
Yeah.
And that I use the term sexual team. Some people have trouble with that, but I really like it because I really believe, like in marriage, you're a financial team, you're a parenting team, you're a sexual team, and you've got to think about that. And that in marriage, to focus on it every day and to realize that for men, you need to figure out what has meaning, what works for your wife.
Yep.
And for the wives to stop thinking about the man's desire negatively.
Yeah.
Because it's not a negative. And I try and help them see this is about emotional connection for them and that biological need. But that the biggest turn on for men is when their wives desire them.
Yeah.
So I think the takeaway is you've got to focus every day. And that's what couples don't do.
It's about the dialogue, which is that my big takeaway is
connection and dialogue.
Yeah. You've got to talk about it.
Yep.
Okay. So Next week, we are going to get into life transition. So we're going to just talk about kind of some of the big ones, going from home to college or moving out on your own for the first time, when you transitioning to married life, transitioning to parenting life, and then transitioning to empty nesters, kind of those big ones, and how to prepare for them a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. We will see you all next week.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.